The alarm went off at 6, same as it did every weekday, and I slapped at it until the room went quiet again. The blinds were tilted just enough to let a sliver of pale Portland morning light cut across the floor. I sat up slowly, rubbing the grit from my eyes, and shuffled to the kitchen to start the coffee. The machine sputtered in protest like it always did, but it got the job done. My apartment was small but clean, the kind of place you could walk from one end to the other in under 30 steps. The carpet had a worn trail leading from the front door to the couch, and the couch itself sagged where the cushions had given up years ago. Everything in the place had a story, most of them about someone else owning it before me. While the coffee brewed, I checked my bank app. Rent was due in a few days, the credit card payment sooner. I had just enough to keep things balanced, as long as nothing unexpected showed up. I was used to the quiet mental math, subtracting grocery lists from paychecks, moving numbers around in my head to see if a little extra might be left over. Most months, there wasn't. I worked as an accountant for a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. It sounded better than it felt. The pay wasn't terrible, but it wasn't enough to move the needle. Promotions were rare. Raises were barely enough to notice. I'd learned to be the first one in the office, the last one out, and the one who quietly fixed mistakes other people left behind. It kept me in good standing, but not much else. The Corolla waiting in the parking lot was pushing its 12th year, paint dulled from too many wet winters, a faint rattle in the front end that only got worse when it rained. Replacing it wasn't an option, so I kept driving it, radio turned up just enough to drown out the sound. Evenings were usually quiet. I'd heat up leftovers, maybe watch something on TV, maybe just sit with a book and let the hours slip by. Sometimes I'd catch myself imagining something else. A kitchen big enough to cook in without knocking into the counter. A place with a view of something better than the neighboring building's brick wall. A trip somewhere warm where rain wasn't a given. They weren't wild dreams, just the sort that always seemed to hover out of reach. It wasn't a bad life. I had a roof over my head, food on the table, and enough left over for the occasional beer with a friend. But it felt like treading water, safe, predictable, and without much change on the horizon. I didn't know it yet, but that horizon was about to rip wide open, and nothing in my life would look the same again. Family was always complicated for me, and not in the sitcom way where everyone bickers, but deep down loves each other. My parents split when I was 14, and within 2 years they'd both remarried. My dad, Gregory, was a high school physics teacher, measured, methodical, the type who could talk about Newton's laws for an hour without realizing everyone else had zoned out. His new wife, Stephanie, was a real estate agent with a taste for things shinier and more expensive than either of them could comfortably afford. Their house looked like a home design magazine had thrown up in it, but I knew the debt hiding underneath was real. My mom, Diane, married Warren, a successful business owner who wore his wealth like armor. He was polite enough, but there was always a quiet edge to him, a sense that he was taking stock of you the way a banker sizes up a loan application. I knew from the start that I wasn't part of the deal. His money was for my mom and whatever future they pictured together, not for me or my siblings. Lisa, my younger sister by 4 years, was the one who could do no wrong. Ivy League degree, married to a surgeon named Paul, 2 kids who looked like they'd been pulled from a magazine ad for children's clothing. Every family gathering seemed to orbit her life, her milestones, her vacations, her house renovations. If she had struggles, they never made it into conversation. Then, there was my older brother, Jason. At 36, he had charisma in spades but no anchor. Jobs came and went. Relationships started fast and ended faster. And when Jason called, it was only a matter of time before the conversation turned into a request for money. He had a knack for making it sound urgent, like the world might end if I didn't help, and a habit of disappearing once I did. On my dad's side, there was Aunt Heather, sharp-tongued, impeccably dressed, and married to a man with more money than sense. She treated family gatherings like stages for her critiques, offering helpful advice that always came wrapped in condescension. Her son, Ryan, had inherited her entitlement but none of her fortune. His gambling habit was an open secret, something the rest of the family ignored out of convenience. The one person who never made me feel like a commodity was Aunt Martha, my mom's younger sister. She taught elementary school, drove an old Honda that rattled almost as much as my Corolla, and lived in a modest apartment filled with plants and books stacked in precarious piles. She didn't have much, but she had a way of showing up when it mattered, remembering birthdays, checking in when she knew I'd had a hard week, listening without judgment. That was the web I lived in. Threads of obligation, competition, and the occasional kindness. Over time, I'd learned to give without expecting anything back. It kept the peace, but it also meant I'd stopped expecting anyone to show up for me. Every Friday after work, I stopped at the same corner store on my way home. Gus's Market was wedged between a nail salon and a dry cleaner, its faded green awning flapping slightly in the Portland wind. Gus had been running the place for decades, and he greeted me like clockwork. He didn't even have to ask what I was there for. $10 worth of lottery tickets, my one weekly indulgence. It wasn't that I thought I'd win. I knew the odds better than most. Numbers were my business, after all. But it was the ritual that mattered. Walking in, handing over the tin, tucking the tickets into my wallet. It gave me permission to imagine something bigger for a little while. Those scraps of paper were less about probability and more about possibility. The family had their opinions, of course. My mom liked to call it a tax on people who can't do math. My dad would pull out the exact odds during Thanksgiving dinner, rattling them off, as if I'd never heard them before. Jason just laughed and told me I'd be better off giving him the $10 directly. At least then, he said, one of us would get something out of it. Lisa didn't waste her breath with jokes. She just gave me that polished smile that said she thought I was being childish. I never argued. Why bother? It was my money, my small rebellion against the grind. $10 a week wasn't going to make or break me, but it bought me something I couldn't get anywhere else, a private moment of hope. On the bus ride home, I'd let myself think about what I'd do if the numbers came up. Pay off my debts, fix the Corolla, maybe travel somewhere far enough that the rain felt like a novelty instead of a constant. Most weeks, nothing happened. A couple of numbers would match, maybe enough for a free ticket, but usually the slips went straight into the trash. Still, the next Friday, I'd be back at Gus's, tin in hand. It wasn't about winning. It was about the space between buying the ticket and checking the numbers, that sliver of time when anything felt possible. I guess that was why the teasing never got to me. They didn't understand it wasn't about the jackpot. It was about the pause, the permission to think beyond rent, utilities, and deadlines. About holding on to the idea that even in a life as predictable as mine, something unexpected could still happen. And eventually, it did. I just didn't know that one of those slips I tucked so casually into my wallet would change everything. My 34th birthday landed on a Friday, which meant I was already headed to Gus's after work. The week had been one long grind. Late nights at the office, juggling deadlines no one else seemed to care about, and a boss who'd managed to turn my work into his win in a client meeting. By the time I stepped through the market's door, the familiar smell of coffee and floor cleaner was almost comforting. "Happy birthday, Danny," Gus said, grinning as he rang up a customer. He'd been selling me tickets for years, and somehow never forgot the date. "Thanks," I said, sliding a 20 across the counter instead of my usual 10. "Figure I'll double my chances today. Birthday luck, right? Special numbers?" he asked, holding out a place slip. I hesitated, then nodded. Normally I let the machine decide, but it felt right to do it differently this time. I marked them carefully. My own birthday, March 16th. My mom's, the 12th. My dad's, the 21st. Martha's, the 9th. And my best friend Chris's, the 30th. 6 numbers tied to people who'd shaped my life, for better or worse. That night, I picked up Thai takeout and poured a beer at home. The ticket sat on the table while I ate, the TV droning in the background. The lottery drawing came and went while I was halfway through a second beer, not really paying attention. It wasn't until about half an hour later that I remembered to check. The first number matched. I smiled a little. The second matched. My chest tightened. Third matched. Fourth matched. I was leaning forward now, hands damp. Fifth matched. My breathing had gone shallow. The 6th number hit, and I just stared at the ticket like it might dissolve if I blinked too hard. I checked again. And again. Then pulled up the lottery's official site to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. There it was, in black and white. The winning numbers matched mine perfectly. I'd won. Not a couple $100. Not a nice vacation's worth. 47 million. I sat back, heart pounding, beer forgotten on the table. After taxes, I'd be looking at around 28 million, a number so far outside my reality I couldn't even picture it. I stood, paced, sat again, ran my hands through my hair. Every few minutes I checked the ticket again, half expecting the numbers to change. Sleep never came that night. I just kept moving between disbelief and a strange, weighty awareness that everything, every routine, every limitation, had just cracked wide open. My life, as I'd known it, was over. What came next was something I couldn't yet imagine. By the time the sun came up, the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a heavy, restless energy that wouldn't let me sit still. The winning ticket lay on my kitchen table, anchored under my coffee mug as if it might float away. I'd been awake all night, my thoughts swinging between wild excitement and a gnawing unease I couldn't quite name. The first impulse was to call someone, my mom, maybe, or Chris. But before I picked up the phone, another thought stopped me cold. Once I said the words out loud, there was no taking them back. The idea of my phone ringing nonstop, of cousins I barely heard from suddenly wanting to catch up, of old coworkers showing up with business ideas, it all felt uncomfortably easy to picture. I opened my laptop and started searching for lottery winners. At first, it was curiosity, but it quickly turned into something else. Article after article told the same story: marriages falling apart, friends turning into strangers, families tearing themselves to pieces over money. Some winners burned through their fortune in a few years, but most just seemed to lose the things they'd assumed were untouchable: trust, privacy, the ability to know if someone's kindness was genuine. One man had given money to his siblings, his parents, even his old high school friends, only to have them turn on him when he stopped. Another woman said she couldn't remember the last time someone called her without asking for something. I read about scams, lawsuits, even threats. The more I scrolled, the more a single truth settled into my gut: once the secret was out, you couldn't get it back. I thought about my family. Lisa, with her polished perfection and subtle condescension. Jason, who could spin a hard luck story in under a minute and vanish just as fast when it came time to pay up. My dad, whose lectures could fill a book, and my mom, whose help often came with strings attached. Even Martha, as kind as she was, would need time to process something like this. The truth was, I didn't know how any of them would react. And maybe I didn't want to find out, not yet. This was the kind of news that reshaped every conversation, every look, every expectation. I wasn't ready for my life to stop being mine. I closed the laptop, slid the ticket into an envelope, and tucked it into the back of a drawer. I'd claim it quietly, through the right channels, but no one needed to know. Not now. Not Chris, not my family, not anyone. Until I had a plan, the only person who needed to carry the weight of this secret was me. And for the first time since the numbers hit, I felt a flicker of control. The morning after deciding to keep quiet, I called in sick for the first time in years. My voice felt foreign saying the words, like I was impersonating someone with the luxury of taking a day off. Once I hung up, I sat at the table with my laptop and searched for attorneys who specialized in large lottery claims. That was a short list, but one name kept appearing with good reviews: Philip Montgomery. His office was downtown, on the 22nd floor of a glass building that reflected the great Portland sky. The waiting room smelled faintly of leather and citrus polish, the kind of place where even the magazines looked expensive. I sat there with my worn jacket zipped halfway up, the winning ticket tucked in an envelope in my inside pocket. My palms were damp. When Philip came out to greet me, he didn't have the slick arrogance I'd half expected. He was in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, glasses that caught the light, and an easy, professional manner that made it hard not to trust him. "Mr. Reed," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "what can I help you with today?" I took a breath, slid the envelope across his desk, and watched his eyes scan the numbers. They widened for just a second before his expression settled into calm professionalism. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you've come to the right place." For the next 2 hours, he walked me through my options. In our state, lottery winners could claim through a trust to protect their identity. He recommended a blind trust, one that would keep my name out of public records entirely. From there, we discussed taxes, investment strategies, and assembling a small team: a financial advisor, a tax specialist, and a security consultant. "The biggest mistake waiters make," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, "is telling too many people too soon. Once word is out, you can't pull it back in." I nodded. "That's why I haven't told anyone." "Good," he said, with a tone that suggested he rarely got to say that. "We'll get the trust established, claim the fund through it, and you'll be in control without your name ever being tied to the prize." By the time I left, I had a folder of documents, a list of next steps, and the strange realization that my life was now split into two versions, the one everyone else would see, and the one I'd actually be living. The money was becoming real, but so was the need to protect it. Walking back to my car through the drizzle, I kept a hand in my jacket pocket, feeling the faint crease of the now empty envelope. For the first time since the win, I felt like I wasn't just reacting. I was planning. 2 weeks after meeting with Philip, the money was sitting in accounts I controlled, hidden behind the name of a trust no one in my personal life had ever heard of. On paper, nothing had changed. I still lived in the same small apartment, drove the same rattling Corolla, and worked the same desk in the same office with the same flickering fluorescent light above it. But in reality, I could have walked away from all of it that very moment and never worried about bills again. Keeping the two lives separate wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Every time someone at work complained about money, I had to bite my tongue. When Derek, the guy in the cubicle across from me, sighed about not being able to afford car repairs, my first instinct was to offer to cover it. But that was a line I couldn't cross without opening doors I wasn't ready to open. Even simple conversations felt different. My mom called one evening to tell me Lisa was planning a family vacation to Hawaii, and I caught myself almost offering to pay for their tickets. Then I remembered the headlines I'd read, the stories about generosity turning into expectation, and I swallowed the words. Living modestly wasn't the hard part. I'd been doing that my whole life. It was pretending to still need to. The Corolla suspension made a noise, like a rusty hinge every time I hit a bump, and I kept thinking about how I could walk onto a lot tomorrow and buy something brand new. But I didn't. Not yet. Even small changes could raise questions, and the last thing I needed was people guessing at answers I wasn't ready to give. At night, when the apartment was quiet, I'd sit with a notebook, sketching out possibilities for the future. Ideas for investments, for things I wanted to do just because I could. Sometimes I thought about quitting the firm, but that felt too abrupt, too visible. I needed a reason for a change that didn't involve the truth. The secrecy started to feel heavy in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about lying. It was about being cut off from sharing something enormous. Chris would call to vent about work, and I'd want to tell him that none of it mattered, that life could flip upside down in an instant. But I didn't. I couldn't. Every day I put on the same work clothes, sat in the same traffic, ate lunch at the same desk, and went home to the same quiet apartment. Outwardly, I was the same Daniel I'd been a month before. Inside, I was someone else entirely. Someone learning how to carry a secret that was as much a weight as it was a gift. The idea started as a flicker, something that came to me late one night while I was staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I'd been thinking about the people in my life, how many times I'd stepped in when someone needed help. Jason's rent when he was between jobs. Lisa's wedding expenses when she swore she'd pay me back. My dad's roof repairs after a storm, only to see pictures of him and Stephanie sipping drinks in Cancun the next month. I kept wondering, if the roles were reversed, would they do the same for me? Would they step up if I had nothing to give in return? The answer I came to, quietly, was no. But I didn't want guesses. I wanted proof. That was when the experiment took shape. I'd tell each of them the same story. The marketing firm I worked for had shut down suddenly after losing its biggest clients. My last paycheck was tied up because the company was under investigation. I'd been applying everywhere, but the job market was slow. To make things worse, I'd had recent medical tests that drained my emergency fund. Rent and bills were piling up, and I needed $5,000 to get through the next couple of months. It was enough money to matter, but not so much that it was impossible. If someone wanted to help, they could. And there'd be no promise of anything in return, just a request and the chance to say yes or no. I knew it was manipulative. Even Chris, if I told him, would probably say it was a bad idea. But I kept coming back to all the times I dug into my own savings to help them, often without hesitation. I wanted to know who saw me as family, and who saw me as a resource. I wrote their names in a notebook: Mom and Warren, Dad and Stephanie, Lisa and Paul, Jason, Aunt Heather, Cousin Ryan, and finally, Aunt Martha. 10 people in total. I made predictions beside each name, just to see how close I'd be. Most were grim. The only one I had real faith in was Martha, and even then, $5,000 was a lot to ask from a schoolteacher living alone. The next step was making it believable. I drafted the story in my head, rehearsed it in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to find the right balance between strain and composure. I'd need to sound like I was holding it together, but not so well that they'd think I didn't need help. When I finally put my phone on the table and looked at the list, a strange mix of anticipation and dread settled over me. This wasn't just about seeing who would help. It was about deciding who deserved a place in my life once I stopped pretending to be the man they thought they knew. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, the same one I'd been using to map out every step since the win. This page was different, though. Instead of numbers or investment ideas, I was writing names. Each one meant something: history, shared blood, or years of being told we were supposed to be there for each other. I started with my mom. She'd probably sound sympathetic, maybe even genuinely concerned, but Warren's grip on their finances was iron tight. My guess? She'd offer some smaller amount or suggest I call my dad instead. It wouldn't be outright refusal, but it also wouldn't be the help I was asking for. My dad was next. Gregory Reed could turn any situation into a lecture about preparedness, and I could already hear the speech. He'd ask about my savings, scold me for not keeping 6 months' expenses in reserve, and wrap it up with something about personal responsibility. If I got anything, it would be a token amount meant to teach me a lesson. Lisa came after. My little sister's life was lined with cushions: Paul's surgeon salary, their beautiful home, private schools for the kids. But I knew the truth. She'd claim everything was tied up in tuition and renovations, offer me the guest room instead, and act like that solved the problem. Jason was easy. He'd say he was broke, maybe promise to help when things got better, then disappear. This was the same guy who still owed me for the last 3 emergencies I'd covered. I wasn't holding my breath. Then there was Stephanie, my stepmother. If I went through her, she'd brush me off without hesitation. Warren was the same way. Both would frame it as a reality check, me needing to live within my means, or choose a better career path. I'd heard those lines before. And Heather? No chance. She'd seized the moment to remind me that she'd once suggested I work at the bank after college, that I'd made my bed, and now had to lie in it. Ryan, her son, would probably be all enthusiasm at first, say he could help, maybe even set a lunch date, then cancel at the last minute and never follow through. The only name I underlined was Aunt Martha. She had the least to give, but the biggest heart. If she had anything, I knew she'd offer it without asking for anything back. But $5,000 was a heavy lift for someone who drove a 15-year-old Honda and picked up tutoring gigs just to keep up with expenses. When the list was done, I sat back and looked at it. 10 names. 10 relationships shaped by years of give and take, mostly me giving, them taking. Soon I'd find out if that balance could ever shift. I wasn't sure I wanted to know, but I needed to. I started with my mom. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice distracted, like she was already doing 3 other things. I laid out the story exactly as I'd rehearsed it: the sudden company closure, my last paycheck caught in limbo, the medical bills that had eaten through my emergency fund. I told her I needed $5,000 to cover rent and expenses until I could land something new. She sighed, told me how awful it all sounded, then quickly mentioned the down payment she and Warren had just made on a lake house. "We're pretty cash poor right now," she said, before suggesting I call my dad or Lisa. She promised to talk to Warren and get back to me, but I knew that meant no. My dad met me for coffee the next day. I told him the same story, but before I'd even finished, he was shaking his head. "Daniel, I've always told you to keep 6 months of expenses saved." He launched into a lecture about budgeting, career planning, and living below my means. When I finally got the chance to ask outright, he leaned back and said, "Stephanie and I are focused on our retirement. It would be financially irresponsible to dip into those funds. He patted my hand like he'd just given me a gift. Lisa's turn came on a Saturday afternoon. Her husband was out golfing, so it was just us in her spotless kitchen. She was all wide-eyed concern until I mentioned the $5,000. Then her smile tightened. They just bought a new Audi, she explained, and the kids' private school tuition was due. She offered me their guest room, which was currently full of storage, and said she'd have to talk to Paul. I left knowing I'd never get a call back. Jason didn't even bother with pretense. I texted him the situation, and he replied, "That sucks, man. Type my stuff right now. I'll call you later." He never did. Calls went to voicemail. Texts were ignored. Stephanie was blunt. "I'm sure this is hard, Daniel, but we can't help. Maybe this is a chance to rethink your spending habits." Warren was worse. "You're not my son. Your finances are your own problem. Maybe you should have chosen a better career." Ryan seemed eager at first, even offered to meet for lunch with a check. The morning of, he texted to say something had come up. I never heard from him again. Aunt Heather, as expected, used the call to remind me that she'd once told my dad I should have gone into banking. She offered no help, but plenty of unsolicited advice. By the end of the week, I collected nothing but excuses, lectures, and thinly veiled judgment. The only thing anyone had given me was proof of what I'd suspected all along. The people I'd helped over the years wouldn't lift a finger for me, not unless there was something in it for them. Jason's silence became louder with each day that passed. I'd sent 2 more follow-up texts, short, direct, impossible to misread, but they went unanswered. When I tried calling, the line rang twice before flipping to voicemail. No return call. "No. Sorry, can't help you." Nothing. For someone who'd never had a problem asking me for money, his sudden inability to speak was almost impressive. Stephanie's voice on the phone was clipped, businesslike. She didn't bother cushioning the blow. "Daniel, this isn't something we can get involved in. We have our own obligations, and helping you right now wouldn't be wise." The way she said, "helping you," made it sound like bailing out a reckless stranger. Warren didn't even pretend to be sympathetic. "You're not my responsibility," he said flatly. "Maybe you should have chosen a career that pays better." Then he ended the call. I'd expected disappointment. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the story started making the rounds. Heather called me out of nowhere, her tone dripping with the kind of satisfaction people get from being proven right. "I hear you've been asking everyone for money," she said. "This is exactly what I warned your father about when you skipped that bank job after college." It wasn't hard to figure out where she'd heard it. My mom or Lisa must have passed it along, and from there it traveled fast. Aunt Martha called me one evening, her voice warm but concerned. "I just heard from your mother about your job. Are you okay?" she asked. She didn't press for details, didn't scold, didn't make it about herself. I told her I was hanging in there, keeping the conversation short because she was the one person I wanted to reach out to directly when the time was right. Meanwhile, the rest of the family's silence wasn't so silent anymore. It showed up in little ways, passive-aggressive texts from my dad about taking responsibility for your own life, messages from Lisa hinting that I'd made everyone uncomfortable by asking around, instead of coming to her first. It was as if my simple request for help had been recast as some kind of manipulation. The irony was hard to ignore. I'd spent years covering their gaps, stepping in when they were short on rent, over budget on weddings, or just plain careless. Now, when I asked for something in return, not a gift, just a loan, they acted like I'd broken an unspoken rule. I stopped calling after that. Not out of anger, but because I'd heard enough. Every excuse, every deflection, every secondhand comment only confirmed what I'd already known before I even picked up the phone the first time. The silence wasn't an oversight. It was an answer. And it told me everything I needed to hear. It was late afternoon when my phone buzzed with Martha's name. I'd been putting off calling her, saving her for last, partly because I didn't want to put her in the awkward position of saying no, and partly because I already knew she'd try to help whether she could afford it or not. "Danny, it's Aunt Martha," she said, her voice warm in a way I hadn't heard all week. "Your mom told me what happened at work. Are you all right?" I hesitated, caught off guard. "I'm managing," I said, keeping my voice low, trying not to give away how much her concern was already getting to me. "Can we meet for lunch tomorrow?" she asked. "My treat. I want to hear everything." The next day, we met at a little diner near her apartment, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that came in thick white mugs. She was already there when I arrived, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, a book tucked beside her on the seat. She stood to hug me, holding on for a second longer than usual. We talked while we ate, her asking questions that were more about how I was holding up than about the details of losing my job. She offered to reach out to a couple of her former colleagues, just in case they knew of openings. I nodded, appreciating the gesture even though I knew it was all part of the act I constructed. When the plates were cleared, she reached into her bag and slid a plain white envelope across the table. "This is for you," she said. I frowned, not touching it. "Martha, I can't." "Yes, you can," she interrupted gently. "It's $3,000. I know it's not what you need, but it should help with the rent. And if you need a place to stay for a while, my sofa pulls out into a bed. It's not fancy, but it's yours if you want it." I stared at the envelope, my throat tightening. I knew without opening it that this was a big chunk of her savings. And I also knew she had her own struggles, her old car, her health issues, the extra tutoring job she picked up to cover her medical bills. "You don't have to pay it back right away," she added. "Get back on your feet first. That's all I care about." The words hit harder than I expected. All week, I'd been swimming through excuses and thinly veiled judgment. And here was Martha, who had the least to give, offering almost everything she had without hesitation, without conditions. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket, not trusting myself to speak right away. For the first time since I'd started this experiment, I felt something other than frustration. I felt seen. And it was from the one person I never had to test to begin with. I asked Martha to come by my apartment a few nights later. I'd been carrying the weight of her kindness ever since our lunch, and the lie that came with it was starting to feel like it was pressing down on my chest. When she arrived, she handed me a small bag of groceries. "Just a few things I thought you might need," and settled onto the couch like she always did, making herself at home without ceremony. We talked for a bit about nothing in particular, the kind of easy conversation we'd always had. But I couldn't shake the thought that she'd handed over nearly all her savings because of a story I'd made up. Finally, I set my coffee down and looked her in the eye. "Martha, there's something I need to tell you," I said. "I wasn't honest with you about my situation." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't say anything, waiting for me to continue. "I didn't lose my job. The company's fine. I made it up. I wanted to see who in the family would help me if I needed it." She stayed quiet for a moment, then leaned back, studying me. "I see," she said finally. "And you came to me last because I knew you tried to help, even if it hurt you to do it. I didn't want to put you in that position unless I had to." She exhaled slowly, not angry, but thoughtful. "I'm not mad," she said. "Sad, maybe. Sad that you felt you had to test people that way. But I understand why you did it." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "You were the only one who offered anything. Everyone else had an excuse." Martha gave a small wry smile. "People show you who they are when helping becomes inconvenient. I learned that the hard way." "What do you mean?" Her eyes shifted toward the window. "When my grandmother passed, I inherited about $50,000. Not a fortune, but more than I'd ever had. Your Uncle Robert, my husband at the time, had big plans for it. Investments, he said. I wanted to save it, maybe put it toward a house someday. We argued for months. I leaned forward. What happened? One day, I found out he'd forged my signature and taken almost all of it. Put it into a friend's restaurant. The business folded in less than a year. When I confronted him, he said it was our money, so he had as much right to it as I did." She gave a humorless laugh. "That was the day I knew the marriage was over." I sat back, letting her words sink in. She'd been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect her, and yet here she was, still willing to hand over nearly everything to help me. "Thank you for trusting me with that," I said quietly. She met my eyes again. "Just remember, Daniel, money doesn't change people. It just shows you who they've been all along." I didn't plan to tell her that night. It was one of those truths I had intended to keep tucked away until I had every last piece of my life arranged. But sitting there, hearing how she'd been burned by someone she trusted, knowing she'd just given me nearly everything she had, I couldn't keep it from her any longer. "There's something else," I said, my voice low. "Something big." Martha set her coffee down, the faint clink of porcelain on the table filling the pause. "All right," she said, watching me closely. I took a breath. 3 weeks ago, I won the lottery. $47 million. After taxes, about 28. You're the first person I've told. Her eyes widened, but she didn't gasp or spill her drink or break into a grin. She just sat back and absorbed it, the way she always did when something mattered. "That explains the experiment," she said slowly. "Yeah," I admitted. "I needed to know who'd be there for me without the money on the table." She nodded, thoughtful. "I understand. So what are you going to do now?" "I've got everything set up, trust, investments, all of it locked down. But I also know exactly what I want to do first. I'm going to help you. Medical expenses, a better place to live, whatever you need." Her face softened into a smile, the kind that never seemed forced with her. "I don't need anything from you, Daniel. I'm happy with my life. My apartment may be small, my car may be old, but I have the things I care about." "I know," I said. "But you've been there for me when no one else was. You didn't ask for anything in return. This isn't about owing you, it's about wanting to." She tilted her head, studying me. "If that's truly what you want, then I'll accept it. But only if it's on your terms, not out of guilt." "Deal," I said. "I want to make sure you're comfortable, and I want to make sure you never have to take on extra work just to keep your head above water." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let this money isolate you. Keep the people who matter close, even if that list is shorter than you thought." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep. "You're at the top of that list." We sat in quiet after that, the hum of the refrigerator filling the room. For the first time since the numbers had come up on that ticket, I felt lighter. Not because the secret was gone, but because I'd shared it with the one person I knew would never see me as just a bank account. I chose a Sunday afternoon, figuring it was the one time I could get them all in the same room. My apartment was too small for comfort, but that was fine. Comfort wasn't the point. One by one they arrived, carrying the energy of people who weren't sure why they'd been summoned. My mom sat with Warren in the corner, murmuring to each other. My dad and Stephanie stood near the kitchen, avoiding eye contact with me. Lisa perched on the edge of the couch, scrolling her phone, while Jason leaned in the doorway like he might bolt at any moment. Heather arrived last, lips pursed as though she already disapproved of whatever this was about. When everyone had settled, I stood where they could all see me. "Thanks for coming," I said. "I wanted to clear the air about something." Lisa glanced up, and my dad crossed his arms. "I know most of you have heard that I've been asking for help recently," I continued. "That's true. I did. I told you I'd lost my job, that I needed $5,000 to cover rent and expenses. What I didn't expect was how quickly that turned into a game of passing responsibility, or, in some cases, ignoring me entirely." My dad shifted, his jaw tightening. "Daniel, we all have our own commitments." "I know," I cut in. "And I'm not saying anyone is obligated to help. But I am saying it was eye-opening to see who could listen without turning it into a lecture, who could offer anything at all, and who disappeared." Jason muttered something under his breath. I turned to him. "You didn't return my calls or texts, but you've had no problem calling me when you've needed money. That's not going to happen anymore." He looked away, jaw tight. I moved my gaze across the room. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I just want to be clear. Whatever I've given in the past, whatever gaps I've filled, that's done. I'll be there for the people who are there for me. Everyone else? We can keep things polite and distant." Heather huffed. "Well, if you just told us the whole story." "I told enough," I said. "What I got back was exactly what I needed to know." The room was tense, full of unspoken retorts no one dared say out loud. My mom gave me a strained smile. "If that's what you need, Daniel, we'll respect it." "I'm glad to hear it," I said, though I doubted it would last. When they left, the air in the apartment felt lighter. I hadn't told him about the winnings, and I didn't plan to. but I had drawn a line. And for the first time, I believed I'd keep it. I handed in my notice on a rainy Thursday morning. My boss looked surprised for exactly 3 seconds before recovering enough to tell me I'd be missed, though his eyes said otherwise. I kept it short, told him I had found an opportunity that better fit my goals. No one needed to know that opportunity was me, with enough resources to rewrite my life on my own terms. For weeks, I'd been thinking about what to do with the money beyond investments. My mind kept circling back to Martha, not just her generosity, but the fact she'd been living with so little for so long, quietly doing good in the world without anyone noticing. That, and the countless older folks I'd seen in her orbit, retired teachers, neighbors, living alone, struggling to get by, and largely invisible. That was where the idea for the nonprofit came from. I wanted something that would give back, something that wasn't about writing checks from a distance, but about building something lasting. A place that could provide home repairs, companionship, financial help, and a sense of community for seniors who'd been left behind. It felt like the kind of work that could mean something. While I lined up the legal and operational pieces with Philip's help, I started quietly working on something for Martha. I found a single-story craftsman house in a quiet neighborhood not far from where I planned to live. Wide doorways, a sunny kitchen, a garden in the back. It wasn't extravagant, but it was hers the moment she wanted it. At the same time, Philip and I drafted the paperwork for a trust in her name. It would cover her medical expenses and provide a monthly stipend she could live comfortably on without ever worrying about running out. The payments would be automatic, discreet, and most importantly, structured so she'd never have to manage a sudden windfall. When the house closed, I drove by one evening and just sat in the car, looking at the warm glow from the windows. I pictured her there, plants in the kitchen, a stack of books by the couch, her old Honda parked in the driveway for as long as she felt like keeping it. I didn't tell her right away. I wanted everything to be in place first: the trust, the nonprofit, my own move into a modest new place where I could work without distraction. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about scraping by or patching holes. I was building something, and not just for me. Walking away from my old job didn't feel like losing stability. It felt like gaining freedom. And with that freedom came a kind of responsibility I didn't want to waste. It started with my dad. Word reached me through Lisa that he'd had a mild heart attack. He was recovering, but the hospital bills had blindsided him. Insurance covered most of it, but not all, and Stephanie was apparently stressed about dipping into their retirement savings. I called the hospital's patient assistance fund the next day and made a payment large enough to clear the balance. I didn't leave my name, just asked them to tell him it had been taken care of. A week later, my dad called to tell me the hospital had found some kind of grant to cover the rest. He sounded relieved, even grateful, but there was no suspicion in his voice. Not long after, Lisa mentioned in passing that Ryan had finally checked himself into rehab for his gambling problem. She was vague about how it was being paid for, which told me it wasn't cheap. I found the facility's donation portal and sent the full amount under a generic donor listing. A month later, I overheard Heather at a family gathering talking about the angel who'd stepped in to help her son. I didn't say a word. Jason was harder. I'd sworn to cut him off after the experiment, but when I heard from a mutual friend that his utilities were about to be shut off, I made a payment directly to the service company. He never connected the dots. Later, he bragged about how he'd managed to work something out with the billing department. I let him keep the story. Each time I did it, I told myself it wasn't about them. It was about me. About keeping whatever good was left between us, even if it had to happen in secret. If they'd known it was me, it would have changed everything. The help would have been seen as leverage, or a way to pull me back into old patterns. Anonymous, it was clean. There was a strange peace in watching them benefit without having to navigate the tangle of thanks, suspicion, and expectation. They could keep their pride. I could keep my boundaries. Martha was the only one who knew, and she never asked why I bothered. Maybe she understood the truth, that helping didn't always have to mean reopening doors you'd already decided to close. The rest of the family went on with their lives, occasionally mentioning the luck they'd had or the break that came at just the right time. I smiled and nodded, content to let them believe in coincidence. They'd never know how close their fortunes had come to passing them by. And I'd never have to explain why I'd chosen to help from a distance, where gratitude couldn't be twisted into entitlement. A year after the numbers on that ticket turned my life inside out, I woke up to a quiet morning in my new place. The rain tapped gently against the windows, and for once, I didn't have anywhere I had to be. No alarm clock dragging me into a cubicle. No stack of unpaid bills waiting on the counter. Just stillness, and the hum of a life I'd built on my own terms. The money had given me choices I'd never had before: where to live, what to do with my time, how to help without draining myself dry. But it wasn't the millions that felt like the real prize. It was the clarity. The freedom from wondering where I stood with people. The clean lines I'd drawn between myself and those who only valued me when I had something to give. The nonprofit was running smoothly now, staffed by people who believed in its mission as much as I did. I visited often, sometimes rolling up my sleeves to help with repairs, sometimes just sharing coffee with the folks we served. Watching a widower light up when we fixed his leaky roof, or hearing an elderly couple laugh because their heat finally worked again, that did more for me than any number in my bank account ever could. Martha had settled into her new home like she'd been there forever. She filled the garden with roses, stacked books high on every table, and hosted her friends for Sunday dinners. She never flaunted anything, never made a show of her comfort. But I could see it in her face. She traded years of quiet worry for ease. The rest of the family remained at arm's length. We spoke at holidays, exchanged polite texts on birthdays, but the old patterns were gone. Some of them had been helped without knowing it. Others had gone on exactly as before. I didn't carry resentment anymore. I'd stopped expecting what they weren't capable of giving. On my walks, I'd sometimes pass Gus's market. I still bought a ticket now and then, more out of habit than hope. Not because I needed the money, but because it reminded me of that slim slice of possibility I used to live for. The difference now was, I didn't need a slip of paper to feel it. Sitting on my porch that evening, watching the rain fade into a pale sunset, I realized the truth. The millions had changed my circumstances, but the real wealth was knowing exactly who I could count on, and exactly who I couldn't. That knowledge was worth more than any jackpot. It was peace. And peace, I'd learned, was something you couldn't buy.